Hello, everybody. It's Michael Hollands once again. I'm joined by Mr. Ashton Gleckman, my good friend and the very talented composer. And I would like to welcome each and every one of you to our second episode of our Score Insider podcast. And today we will focus on the career of one of the most important composers in the history of film, Mr. John Williams. And welcome. And Ashton, it's great to have you back.
It's great to be with you, and welcome everyone to episode 2 of Score Insider. I think that you would agree, Michael, in saying that John Williams has been one of, if not the most influential people in the history of film music, in terms of his various innovations, his various contributions to the history of film, and really looking forward to sort of diving into his work.
Like you said, John Williams is one of the most important and most influential composers. He still continues to go strong. I mean, he's 87 years old. He's had a career which spans more than 6 decades. I mean, imagine that. And it's just an absolute asset of this business.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, if we look back at his first score, I mean, we're going all the way back to 1958. So his career has, started at that point and has sort of gone on and is still continuing to go on. And his music is being played in concert halls all around the world. His music is still, premiering in terms of his concert music, but also his film music, and it's just more alive than ever. And I think it's just an incredible testament to his great contributions to this field, and his incredible craft and his incredible musicality has just really been something that has been a really important part of my life and an important part of my development as a composer. I've always been very inspired by him, and not only inspired by his music, but also just his work ethic. I mean, he is incredibly prolific. The amount of work that he has created, over 150 scores. So there's just so much to admire about his career. And his career starts long before what I just described, 1958, the B-movie Daddy-O. It actually goes back much farther. So I think it might be fun to just go back and take a look at his early life and just a bit about the way in which he got started. So John Williams was born in 1932, and interestingly enough, his dad was actually Johnny Williams, and I think that's funny because he ended up going by the name Johnny in the 50s and 60s upon his arrival in Los Angeles, so his father's name. And his dad was a jazz percussionist, and he worked very commonly with the known group, the Raymond Scott Quintet. And I think it was really the point where his family moved in 1948 to Los Angeles is when things really started to pick up, because he started to, study jazz at the LA high school, and he really started to get more involved with all of the, music communities out there. And he also attended the Hollywood High School as well, and that's where he graduated. So all of these various things started to pick up in Los Angeles, and that's sort of when things started to get moving. And then, of course, as you probably know, Michael, it was 1950 or so, 1952, when he went to the Air Force. And that's really the dawn of what he describes to be a really important chapter, if you want to talk a little bit about that.
Sure. I mean, you're absolutely right. His career basically started back then. Everybody has to start somewhere, and practice makes perfect. So there isn't anybody who just enters the scene at the age of 20 and is, and becomes enormously successful. So most of the composers today, or of any era, they basically started out, in bands or rock bands, or they played in jazz bands. So as did John Williams. And when he entered the Air Force and started writing some music there and arranging some stuff, that was probably when he learned the ropes, and when his interest developed, and then he found he transitioned into film music. Luckily for each director and for each composer and for each fan. And what happened after the Air Force, what happened then was just so amazing, and his career just skyrocketed.
Absolutely. I mean, and another thing about that period in the Air Force that, the time that he spent there is that it gave him the opportunity to really just experiment in all of these various sort of occupations. He was not only playing the piano, which he would go on to study in New York City at Juilliard, but he was also, playing brass instruments, and he was, conducting and arranging music. And it just gave him the opportunity to really dive into each and every one of these different occupations, which, later in his career would really, really contribute to his skill and his craft.
Absolutely. And it's not just, I mean, I'm glad you brought this up, but it's to become a great composer or to become a great storyteller, it's not just, studying music. It is also you are born with a certain instinct. And, I think sometimes it is just as much about studying as it is what you have inside of you creatively from the very beginning. And John Williams was, born with this amazing instinct. He is this incredible dramatist, this musical dramatist that knows exactly how to underscore human emotion, be it a drama, be it a thriller or an adventure movie or a sci-fi movie. I mean, that's hard to do. And he is an all-around composer. He has written for pretty much every genre, and he has spawned great and amazing scores. And that's something we should not take for granted. I mean, I'm certain there are many composers, or quite a few composers, that are comfortable or most comfortable with one particular genre, or they're just being typecast. That always depends. But he is one of the guys that has been tremendously successful, covering basically every genre for decades.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and another thing about John Williams is that in addition to being this great musician and this tremendous composer, he is also a astonishing storyteller. I mean, that's really where his skills in the arena of film really stem from. It's just his ability to connect to all of these tiny little details within the movie that, the movies that he scores. When you look at like the finale of E.T., for example, and you look at each one of those moments during that 10-minute final sequence, he's able to just connect with each glance of each character. He's able to connect with the slightest element of the performance and the slightest detail in the storyline, and musically contribute to that. And I think that, John Williams could be a tremendous composer, but if he didn't know how to tell stories, I don't think the impact would necessarily be there that we now associate with his film scoring. He would still be an astonishing, world-class, groundbreaking composer. But his work in film, stems from his passion, his love, and his skill in storytelling.
Absolutely. And when you look at the movies he has scored, you will notice there are many sync points. So it's not just a, let's say, 5-minute or 10-minute piece of music, which is then edited and and put into certain scenes to make it work. There is a particular reason for the music to sound the way it sounds, and so many scenes are attached to sync points, be it the Raiders of the Lost Ark, or so many others. So this music is so intrinsic to the storytelling and to the whole cohesiveness. So it's absolutely amazing.
I absolutely agree with you. I think one really interesting thing about John Williams's career is those early days actually performing on film scores. And I think that I think in a lot of interviews, he's attributed a lot of his early experience to, his times working with Bernard Herrmann and Alfred Newman and many other composers, orchestrating and, playing piano. And that was a really, really strong part of his development. And I think that especially getting into the arena of film scoring, one of the most important, helpful sort of tools is to be able to watch other people and sort of how they work. And I think that this was probably a great experience for him to be able to introspectively look at everything and to see how things operated.
Absolutely. I mean, that's an important aspect, to learn from other people and to watch them work. And then you grow as an artist and as a person, because obviously you don't know everything from right off the bat. So you have to come in and watch other people work and see how they write and see how they talk to directors and all that. So and that's very important. And it certainly was important for him, I think.
Oh, absolutely. And also, he played piano on Jerry Goldsmith's scores, which is your favorite composer. So I think that's an interesting
Yeah.
fact. Yeah.
And those two, I mean, I think they knew each other very well, and as far as I know, they also challenge each other, and I think in a certain era, these two were probably the hottest, most in-demand composers working in the entire industry.
No, absolutely. Another interesting thing about John Williams' musical aspect that I'm pretty interested in is something very similar to something that James Horner went through in his career, is where they spent a certain amount of time in a very specific genre collaborating with a specific director, and that really plunged them forward into other works. And John Williams spent quite a bit of time working on actually disaster movies like Poseidon's Adventure and Towering Inferno with directors like Irwin Allen. And, James Horner spent a lot of time, working on all of these really, really early horror films. And then Howard Shore worked on all these David Cronenberg horror films. So
Yeah.
it's interesting that a lot of composers that now work on all these various different projects, ranging in different genres, they started off in these very niche sort of almost arguable B-movie genres.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, no, James Horner, I think he also scored the Roger Corman movies, but that's basically a given because obviously when you enter the scene, you're not an A-list composer right away. So it's everybody starts at the bottom, and you have to be at the beginning at least be content with scoring C movies or B movies, movies that have a very limited budget, and that's how basically everybody starts. And some are very fortunate to become A-listers, and they became so influential, and others, unfortunately, they kind of slipped through the cracks a little bit. But that's just how the business works, I guess. But John Williams, certainly, his name is synonymous with film music and music greatness.
I absolutely agree with that. How about we jump ahead here to 1974, which would be a very, very important year in John Williams' career, because this would be the year in which he would meet and collaborate on the first film with a little-known name named Steven Spielberg.
Yeah.
So this would be the year that would start history in film, and I don't say that lightly. I mean, this collaboration is, I think, arguably the most important collaboration in cinema. The amount of storytelling and the amount of work that these two have done together is nothing short of incredible and inspiring. And 1974, the Sugarland Express was the first project they worked on. And it's interesting because Spielberg actually approached John Williams, who at this time was a very, very young composer. And Spielberg had actually found his music and approached him. And that's sort of how their collaboration sort of began, and from there it just skyrocketed,
Absolutely. And you're right, it is probably the single most important
and that's saying
director.
a lot. There's been a lot of there's been a lot.
It is
Yeah.
the single most important director-composer relationship, or at least in the top three. It's always hard to say it is the most important, but it certainly is in the top three, and if not number one. And what's also Steven Spielberg, he always hired John Williams. He's not a director that kind of bounces around and finds a different
You mean he's not Michael Mann?
Yeah.
don't even get
or
me
other
started.
guys. There are plenty examples. And of course, if it doesn't work out, it doesn't work out, and there are also no scheduling conflicts. So, and but there are very few movies directed by Spielberg that John Williams' name wasn't attached to, and they have this incredible work relationship. And Steven Spielberg is as one of my favorite directors, maybe number one, but it's a tie between him and Martin Scorsese, I think. And absolutely, and Steven Spielberg is he seems so comfortable with the use of music in his films, and he knows how important it is. And when you look at the movies like Sugarland Express or also the Jaws, which is probably I love the movie Jaws, and it will always be in my top 5 Steven Spielberg. And it's such a brilliant movie. And if you look at how young these two were back in the day, and look at the movie that Spielberg shot and the score by John Williams, which earned him his second Oscar. So it's such an important score. And we did talk about this in our first episode, that Steven Spielberg actually thought that John Williams was kidding when he when he presented him the main theme. And but the main theme, as you know, and quote unquote, as simplistic it may seem, it is all the more effective. And the entire score is absolutely brilliant film from start to finish.
And yeah, I mean, and one thing to realize is, even though that specific score, when you go back and you listen to it, even though it is centered around those two notes, you know what? It always makes me laugh whenever anybody says, "Oh, that score, it's so incredibly simple. It's just these two notes." If you look at it, it's two notes, but it's surrounded by this massive, huge symphonic presence. And I mean, it's like other John Williams works, it's practically one mega big concert piece, but it's centered around these two notes, like Beethoven's Fifth was centered around, you know, the da 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 motif, you know. So it's first of all, it's a vital part not only in his career, in John Williams' career, but in, I think, film history, because it was these two young guys. You know, Spielberg had been sort of sneaking his way illegally onto the Universal lot after overusing his summer pass, and so you know, he finally got a film picked up. And before long, he was working on Jaws, which, you know, throughout the production underwent some production errors. You know, they had built the shark multiple times, which had broken because they used it in salt water, and they had to go to the Universal lot and shoot it there. And, you know, it was a film that many executives would say it's a shark movie. I mean, it should have failed. You know, many executives probably would say, but it ended up just being a perfect example of how to create tension, and it was just a lot of fun too, you know.
Absolutely, it's one of the prime examples for me how to shoot a movie and how to build a tension. And of course, back in the day, of course, there wasn't any CGI and all that stuff, but it is not a movie which relies heavily on any kind of special effects. You know, it's a story about, you know, it's an adventure story, and you focus on the characters, you focus on the storytelling, which Steven Spielberg is brilliant at doing. And well, the effects in the movie are, to me, secondary, because it's so suspenseful and it's so well crafted, you know, in terms of editing, in terms of directing, in terms of composing, and it's just one of those brilliant pieces of cinematic art.
And the interesting thing is that the music, if you really think about it, they couldn't afford actual special effects, which is why you don't end up seeing the shark a whole lot of the movie. And the music itself is the special effects. You know, you're seeing the shark through that theme. And which is the interesting thing, is the music has such an incredible presence. It really acts and functions as though it's a character within the movie. And, you know, we were talking about Spielberg and Scorsese, and the incredible thing is how all these different directors use music so differently. How Scorsese will use these songs, and Kubrick will use these classical pieces that just sort of, in a very almost horrific thriller-esque way in movies like The Shining, just linger through every single frame. And Spielberg is, you know, has these wonderful, beautiful, orchestral pieces written by John Williams. I think that it's so incredible, the different ways in which these directors really pinpoint music, and how these different composer collaborations really develop and really make a stamp on the director's films and the director's career as a whole, you know?
Absolutely. And in terms of Steven Spielberg, it is absolutely true that Williams mostly writes, you know, not necessarily usually symphonic pieces of music. They can also be very quiet and delicate. You know, it always depends on the movie. But one of the prime examples to me being E.T., which John Williams scored in, I believe, 81, 82. And it's a score which is bold and also delicate. And if you mentioned that at the beginning, Ashton, if you look at the last 10 to 15 minutes of this film, it is just mind-blowing, to see how Williams underscored everything that happened on the screen. And it is a textbook example of good, very good film scoring.
That is incredibly accurate. It is a textbook definition of brilliant film scoring, brilliant writing, brilliant storytelling, and that's what makes, look, I mean, I was attending a class that that Conrad Pope was teaching, and Conrad Pope is, of course, John Williams' incredible orchestrator. He's a very incredibly talented person, and really, really nice guy. And he was talking about the E.T. score, and we took a day and we just sort of looked through that score. And my gosh, I mean, he said, if you're looking for an example of film scoring, of great orchestral writing, of anything like that, just buy the E.T. score and study that. And, for him and for me now, I mean, that score is really just the prime example of great orchestral film scores. You know what I mean?
It is. And I was attending a live to picture performance of E.T. twice, actually, when David Newman conducted E.T. And David Newman, fun fact, he actually played violin on that score. And it was so mind-blowing, watching this live performance put up against the picture when Dave was conducting. And I saw it twice on I believe it was on Friday, and then I went back on a Saturday when David was in Germany conducting, and it was so amazing, this watching this young orchestra, and that those guys were really young, and watching them perform it and David conducting it so beautifully, that was absolutely off the charts.
And I think like the decision at the end of that movie when the spaceship rises up and you see E.T. finally going back, and Elliot's down below with his family, and they're all looking up, and there's this very, very emotional moment. Many other composers would treat that moment as a very sad moment, and because of the genius and because of the mind of John Williams, he treats it as a moment of triumph. Finally E.T. has gone home, and even though there is this separation of connection between the character of E.T. and Elliot, there's still this triumph because Elliot has finally gotten his friend home, and he goes into this beautiful fanfare, which I think is, just the prime example of, why I love his music and his work so much,
Absolutely. Do you have a favorite John Williams, Steven Spielberg collaboration?
Schindler's List.
Schindler, okay.
Schindler's List, yeah. I just think that the inclusion of, first of all, Itzhak Perlman, is just, his violin performance on that score is so incredibly expressive and incredibly emotional, and you can listen to that music and you're automatically back in the film, which says a lot. And the music just has such a strong relationship with everything occurring on screen. And of course, those who are familiar with the film knows how extremely important to history this film was, and the importance of the music as well in the process of the film is vital. And another thing about Schindler's List that I really want to enforce is that John Williams in this film, like many other films such as Munich, when he's going into all of these various cultures in different places, he's immersing himself in these various musical elements. So in Schindler's List, when we're going into cities in Poland, into Krakow, into different cultures, into the Jewish cultures, he's immersing himself in that musical aesthetic, and he's actually writing with the specific intervals and the specific musicality that's associated with the hundreds of years of musical history in regards to these cultures. So he has a tremendous respect, and I think that Schindler's List for me is why, it was the reason why I actually fell in love with the music of John Williams, and it's just I think a great example of his genius.
It is, and it's one of Steven Spielberg's best and most important films. And it's also one of those films that should be mandatory in every high school. We actually watched it back in high school, back in the day. So it's a hard pick. It's hard to watch at times.
It's incredibly
depending on.
hard. I think that in a situation like that though, it's really just about, even though it's difficult to watch, it's obviously very, very important, that we continue to discuss that stuff. And what that film did, and what John Williams and Steven Spielberg did with that film is they brought it into culture again. People had for the longest time wanted to just completely forget it, and the awful things that can happen when you begin to forget things. And this film brought it back into culture, and it of course, I think it brought in this whole new focus to remembering and respecting, prolonging and continuing the messages of history.
Absolutely, great film, great score, and
yeah, go ahead.
It's one of those scores that I just can't to listen regularly because it is so incredibly sad. It's pretty. It's beautiful, of course it is. It is brilliant writing, but it's incredibly sad. And I can't listen to it every week. It's just too
I would definitely say my favorite cue on that score is I Should Have Done More. It's the cue that's playing when Schindler at the end of the film is leaving and they're outside of the factory, and it's this incredibly emotional cue and very, very well acted scene on behalf of Liam Neeson, and the way in which the music is just I think the great thing about John Williams is that even though his pieces are so multidimensional and so surrounded with extraordinary writing, he still knows how to pay attention and respect these tiny little intimate simple ideas. So these themes that he grows throughout that movie, but E.T., Jurassic Park, any of these films, he's able to surround them in this incredible writing, but he never loses the simplicity of the central ideas.
Yeah, absolutely brilliant. And I think you were going to ask me about my favorite score.
Your favorite score from John Williams. Yeah.
In terms of Spielberg, John Williams, I would say my number one, and that's really difficult, but I would go with Jurassic Park. The film was released in 92, 93, and I was really young back then. And when I watched it, I was so amazed by this movie and by the acting and by the. Of course, many kids are into dinosaurs and all that stuff, and it was huge. But one of my all-time favorite scenes in any movie would be the journey to the island when the chopper flies right through between those little mountains. Then you hear the main theme, and that is absolutely mind-blowing and one of my all-time favorite scenes in any movie. And that cue, I think it's like an 8 or 9 minute cue, 9-minute piece of music. It is I would say one of the best in his entire career. I absolutely adore this piece of music. Wonderful.
I absolutely agree. And there's also some great in those movies. There's some great action cues as well. Like I remember in the second film, The Lost World, there's this great raptor chase. If you remember that one.
Yeah, sure.
And it's a great action cue. Just a great example of great action writing.
Absolutely. But that is so amazing.
So then there's 1977. Where, interestingly enough, in the last episode, we completely forgot to mention this film all the way up until the end, which was, on my part, I apologize, because I feel a little embarrassed to have forgotten this, but Star Wars.
Yes.
Wow.
We did actually mention it then at the very end of our episode when we realized we forgot to include it, and yeah. Let's say shit happens.
Shit happens. Yeah, I mean, I think the thing about Star Wars is, first of all, the role that it's played in inspiring generations of composers to follow that score is remarkable. I mean, if you look at any interview with composers in the last 20 years and they ask when was the first time that you were inspired by film music, and you made the decision that you wanted to write music for picture. It happened sitting in a theater in 1977, with my parents watching Star Wars, and and something about that film. First of all, of course, in terms of its visuals and its overall sort of production value, it was incredibly innovative. But we had undergone this period for quite a while where we weren't getting a ton of these big, huge orchestral scores as much as we did back in the Golden Age, for example. And Star Wars came along, and we pretty much have this new, reinvented, masterful, Strauss, Dvorak-esque piece with little hints of Steiner and Korngold, and it brought back this whole other, past of wonderful orchestral writing and film scores. And of course, the use of leitmotifs, it was also a very strong part of this series.
Yes.
And this film began this cult phenomenon, around the world, and it's still continuing to this day. Episode 9 is going to be released this year, scored by John Williams, which will be his final entry, which is a pretty fascinating full circle, narrative.
Absolutely, couldn't agree more. Star Wars, I mean, you're right. Many people, many composers say, well, back in the day, I was watching Star Wars and I fell in love with the music. I was infatuated by the music. And I mean, rightfully so. I mean, look at those films. Look at the opening of the movie. What John Williams came up with is absolutely amazing. Not only one of the best main titles, but also one of the most brilliant pieces of music ever written for a movie. And it is, how do you top that? How do you recapture that?
And it's interesting because he sort of arguably kept topping it just sort of over and over again, especially in the main trilogy. It's remarkable.
Amazing. I mean, the main trilogy back in the day, it was the highlight, for me personally, the Star Wars highlight, not only in terms of filmmaking of the Star Wars movies, but also in terms of the Star Wars scores. And the new ones starting, I think episode 1 was released in 99, I believe. So it was still pre-millennium. And those movies, at least as far as I am concerned, are absolutely weak, quote unquote, weak compared to the old ones. So, but musically speaking, there are still so many highlights. For instance, you have the duel of the amazing, absolutely. Or episode 1, the duel of the fates.
Oh my gosh, yeah, and they bring that back in episode 3 during the massive lightsaber sequence. Star Wars is, of course, that sort of invented practically in film a whole entire style of writing, a whole entire style of action writing, and the sequences with the trumpets and the agile string runs and all of this incredible detailed writing. I think that Star Wars was at the forefront of that. But the way in which he could go from some huge action cue with massive choirs recorded at Abbey Road Studios down to this tiny little minuscule solo instrument, and then so there was so much diversity and so much variety within those scores, which is part of what made it so, I think, successful, is because it wasn't always loud, it wasn't always quiet, it wasn't always this style, it wasn't always that style. It was sort of throughout the whole series, it's been everything, which is which is the great thing.
Absolutely, couldn't agree more. An important piece of cinema.
Yeah, and that same year, there was Close Encounters of the Third Kind, 1977, with Steven Spielberg.
Yeah, amazing score. I think the film itself, it's a lovely movie. I don't love it as much as I do other Spielberg films, but it's still very nice. And
for me, the third act is really the take home from that movie.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I also love the Richard Dreyfuss. I mean, I loved his acting, and I loved him in Jaws, and I think he's a really, really good actor. And Spielberg brought him back for Close Encounters, and everything worked out well. And John Williams wrote another very good score, and they just, were on a roll. And how do you stop them? You can't.
You can't stop the Williams Spielberg duo at all. So we have 1977, which was a very, very groundbreaking year. And then we, of course, go into the 80s period, going into the 90s, where we had scores, such as, Schindler's List and Jurassic Park, which the actual interesting thing about those two films is that those were actually sort of being made at the exact same time, too. So both Spielberg and Williams were working on those at the exact same time. When Spielberg was shooting, all of the sequences in Krakow, Poland for Schindler's List, he was actually editing Jurassic Park during the evenings to get his mind off of what he was doing. So those were both occurring simultaneously. Another thing to mention in John Williams and Steven Spielberg's sort of repertoire is, of course, the Indiana Jones series, which is, some of you might have heard is actually coming back for a final installment pretty soon here.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Do you have a favorite of those 4 films now?
I do. I do have a favorite score-wise and also film-wise. I think in terms of the movies, I love the first and the third the most. In terms of score, I would say yes, the first and the third as well. I love what John Williams did with the second installment of Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom. I love the dark wires and all that stuff. That was really, really good. And I liked the film. I absolutely like it. But to me, the best Indiana Jones movies are Raiders of the Lost Ark, and then of course Indiana Jones, the third part. The second one I like as well. I also like the fourth one, but...
Me too, actually. That's an interesting thing. We get into that because there's always these films in these series which are just sort of thrown to the side. And that was one of those movies where everybody seemed to sort of dislike it, and I actually sort of enjoyed it, even though certain parts of it, of course, we're a little bit redonkulous. Like the intro sequence where he survives a nuke attack in a refrigerator, but it's Indiana Jones, so we can forgive that, okay?
Yeah.
But it's fun, it's why I love Indiana Jones. It's just pure adventure, and Harrison Ford, just rocks it.
Totally. It's a fun movie. It's an entertaining movie, but I think, I don't think it was necessary to shoot that film. Yeah, but of course it's not crap or nonsense, but it's a good entertainment. And of course, having Spielberg attached also adds a certain, level of quality, of course. But it's definitely not my favorite Indiana Jones movie. Like I said, the first one, The Raiders of the Lost Ark, and The Last Crusade, those are my favorite Indiana Jones movies. Yeah.
And then, so let's just sort of start going through and highlighting some of our just sort of hidden gems or things that, because there are so many movies from the period that we just described all the way through to the contemporary. And there's so many hidden gems. Maybe we should start in the 90s. Do you have any, 90s Williams scores that you find are very particular?
Yes, of course. But the number one 90s score, I did mention that's probably, Jurassic Park was my favorite Spielberg-Williams collaboration. But other than that, and I don't think it's a hidden gem, but it's like everybody should know that, it's Hook. And I think this is one of John Williams' finest efforts. It's so thematic, it's so adventurous, it's so brilliant. And if you, just before our podcast, I was listening to some of my favorite cues of Hook. For instance, the piece, I think it's brilliant. Remembering Childhood, which is a 10-minute piece of music, which is, yes, I think, and then the, when Peter Pan, Robin Williams, starts, flying again, and then you hear the glorious main theme, and how I get goosebumps every time I listen to it. I get goosebumps every time I watch that scene.
It's one of those beautiful childhood movies that is so, it is so just sort of, it captures the wonder and the beauty of being a kid and having that, I don't know, that, again, that word wonder, I think, is perfectly capable of describing that movie,
Absolutely. Hidden gems, that's pretty tough. But I can tell you, one of the scores that everybody is talking about from that period in his career, I could name two, which are some of my favorites: Sleepers and Home Alone. Home Alone, I love it. I watched it when I was a kid, and I still love the movie. And it's a score, of course, a very family-oriented film, but how Williams scored it, the lovely family motif and the strings, and then also one of my favorite cues, building the trap when Macaulay Culkin is, getting ready to mess up the bad guys, and that's brilliant. And also, Sleepers, it's not one of his best efforts, but the final cue, or one of the final cues at the reunion when they're all sitting at one table and having a good time after all the shit they had been through. It's a beautiful piece of music. It gets to me every time, and thus Sleepers holds a special place in my heart of all the 90s Williams scores. And it's a brilliant movie. I mean, Barry Levinson, he directed one hell of a movie, which is also it's not it's not easy to digest. That's a pretty tough film.
Absolutely. Another thing I want to mention from that period is Far and Away, which is a often overlooked score because the movie is less than brilliant, but it's watchable, and two good performances from Tom Cruise and Nicole Kidman. But the score is breathtaking. If you just listen to the ending credits, the love theme, and I'm gonna go ahead and play it in the video right now. So you'll be hearing the love theme right now from Far and Away. And it is just, he uses the pan flute and he immerses himself in the traditions of Celtic writing. And you can tell when you listen to the score that he just had a fun time doing it too. I mean, you could tell he really just sort of got into it and really spent a lot of time in this specific musical culture. But yeah, just a beautiful score, and one of the highlights for me of the 90s. And then, of course, there's Armistead and Saving Private Ryan, which is a beautiful, beautiful score. And I think that Saving Private Ryan is just a great example of what we now associate to be the classic heroic American, orchestral themes. Because we, of course, saw that in Band of Brothers and a little bit in the Pacific. And Saving Private Ryan, for me, is really just the foundation of that. It's got the beautiful choirs and extraordinary writing.
Amazing. I mean, Saving Private Ryan, that's actually, I think, one of the best Spielberg movies of the 90s. And the score, I mean, my favorite cue, of course, is Hymn to the Fallen, which is absolutely astounding. But the score, it's not the, let's say, classic war movie score, if there is such a thing. It's first of all, the first 30 minutes of the film, they don't have any score at all. It's not the entire,
which I sort of praise that. I praise that decision because that intro scene very easily could have been sentimentalized by using score. And that's the farthest thing I think they wanted to do. I mean, you have this 30-minute sequence that is of pure terror and of pure brutality, and I think that it's sort of hard to watch. It's very hard to watch, actually, even when you go back and watch it now, even with all of the different war movies we've had and all of the violence in cinema. It's very difficult to watch, seeing what these people went through. And I feel like if you were to put on score, it might have sentimentalized things. Like when you have this soldier who's missing limbs and he's screaming for his mother. If you put on sad music, automatically now you're messing with the truthfulness of this scene. So I respect the decision that they made to leave out the score for that section. But when the score does come in, it's what you'd expect from a John Williams, Steven Spielberg film.
Absolutely.
So then, going into the 2000s, we'll just sort of go through, of course, The Patriot, wonderful, beautiful acoustic guitars, and really nice American sort of Civil War-esque revolutionary themes. So again, another situation where he's sort of immersing himself in this different type of musical culture, but still an orchestral score. And then AI, which has some very underrated cues in there.
Yes. I mean, AI, you can never leave that out or ignore that. I mean, I know some people that said, I didn't like the film at all. I mean, they have a right to their own opinion. I think it's a gorgeous movie and also a real tearjerker. and but I loved it. I mean, I loved every bit of it, and I think it's one of his best films of the 2000s, and it is really heartbreaking. And once again, it told a beautiful story. And some people may believe that he kind of overdid it a bit, in terms of the tear-jerking aspect. But I mean, I like being moved by a movie, and I am not ashamed to say that this film touched me. And why would I be ashamed? It's it's one of the reasons why I watch movies. It's not just the I want to be moved. I want to have something to think about, and it's Steven Spielberg does it so brilliantly, and of course John Williams does so too by his ability as a musical storyteller. And AI, yes, I mean my favorite cue being the reunion. It's really, really, really touching. Yeah.
Yeah, I was recently, again, the same situation I was in Vienna attending all those classes, and one of the things that was the highlight for me was getting the chance to go to a concert where one of the people that put on the actual performance, Dmitry Levich, who plays on a lot of scores and at the Synchron stage, and he works very, very heavily in Austria, but also in Los Angeles, and they played AI, and it is just a beautiful live, and the music works really, really well too, away from the picture, but also, again, like you were saying, Osment's character, I just think one of the great characters of the early 2000s, just a great performance, especially off the back of The Sixth Sense.
Absolutely.
And
Couldn't agree more.
Yeah, and then so let's touch on this little film franchise. I keep going back to all these little things because who's heard about them? This thing called Harry Potter. Some people talk about it. Harry Potter, which is my favorite film franchise of all time. Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's Stone, and I think Prisoner of Azkaban are really the two highlights from his work, because of course, while he was doing the Chamber of Secrets, there were scheduling conflicts. So William Ross, John Williams wrote a handful of new music, and then a lot of it was sort of arranging and all of that. And but some of the new material he did write in part two was extraordinary, like Fox the Phoenix and the Chamber of Secrets cue, or the main theme. But yeah, there was so much really incredible content in one, and especially for me, three.
I mean, Harry Potter, it's so iconic, and John Williams was a very appropriate choice, perfect choice actually for those movies, and he managed to portray and underscore all of the let's say the majesty of all the movies and the magic of the movies. So it was really, really beautiful, and I like those scores a lot. I mean, I must admit, I'm not the biggest Harry Potter fan in the world. It's I think you either like it or you love it, or I mean, there are also some people that are just in between, like me, as I am, I guess. I like the movies. There is nothing wrong with those, but I'm not totally into Harry Potter, I must admit. But I can totally see why people love them. I mean, why not?
Yeah. Again, they're films where you can just watch them and you just sort of fall into that world. And because the world is so developed and so realized by the author, J.K. Rowling, and of course the various directors that contributed, whether it be Alfonso Cuarón, or whether it be Chris Columbus, or whether it be David Yates. I just think that there's so much immersion in that film series, and John Williams' music is, I think, at the centerpiece of that. Along with the central performances, by Emma Watson and by Daniel Radcliffe and Rupert Grint. But I don't know, something about the Harry Potter score, the original Harry Potter score, it's just timeless. It just hasn't lost 1 ounce of its impact, even all these years later.
Absolutely. I mean, it is one of those movie franchises that will live on forever, and I mean, I certainly hope so. I mean, it's something that people can watch, and they kind of dive into this world of magic and sorcery. And I mean, if they enjoy it, it's great. I mean, that's one of the reasons why we go and watch the movies, you know. And it's I'm sure many people enjoy those films tremendously, and rightfully so. I mean, it's life is tough enough as it is, you know. Why not, you know, find something to hold on to make yourself feel better, you know.
Absolutely, I totally agree. Going into to sort of finish off his incredible music evolution, which is still continuing. We sort of enter this period of just hit after hit, sort of after hit in terms of scores. I've loved all of these recent, you know, sort of mid 2000 scores, like you know, of course, Revenge of the Sith. You had War of the Worlds and Memoirs of a Geisha and Munich, where you had Munich especially was really, really pretty in terms of you know, A Prayer for Peace, which was my favorite cue from that movie. The string writing is so grand and wonderful, and then War Horse and Lincoln with the very sort of delicate, very similar in terms of the overall sort of approach of the very, you know, brave American themes that we heard from Saving Private Ryan, but in a much more subtle way. Do you have any favorite scores in the sort of recent Williams years?
Wow, that's tough. The recent years, well, that depends on what you would regard as a recent years.
Yeah.
I mean,
I guess, yeah, 2000, you know, 2000 on.
Yeah. Catch Me If You Can, one of my favorites. Love that movie. I think it's really love the score. The Memoirs of a Geisha, I like that one a lot. Munich, of course. Lincoln had some pretty good parts in there as well. And War Horse, of course, too. Yeah, those are pretty decent, pretty good. And of course, the latest, you know, Star Wars scores by John Williams, those are really, really good as well. And if you look at his output, I mean, the guy is, like we said before, 87 years old, and he's still going strong and writing beautiful music, and you know, he moves an audience. So that's it's amazing. But I actually, before we wrap things off, I'm sure there are many people out there that would say, "Wow, how could you leave out that score or this score?" I mean, it's so hard to really, you know, cover every important score, and let alone, you know, every score that the audience might like. So we could do a 10-hour podcast and still not be finished. But I actually forgot some pretty important scores, at least important for me personally. 7 Years in Tibet, John Williams and I believe Jean-Jacques Annaud directed it. Really beautiful. And also Born on the 4th of July, directed by Oliver Stone. I think that, yeah, absolutely. I mean, beautiful theme, which was also reused in a couple of trailers. For instance, you know, Carlitos Way, the film directed by Brian De Palma. They used John Williams' score to they used the Born on the 4th of July cue on that trailer, which worked tremendously, absolutely, really great. And Oliver Stone, I think, also one of the directors that actually, you know, tries to, you know, put on something that people can actually think about, sometimes more, sometimes less. I mean, I like his movies. JFK, for instance, you know, that's also pretty good.
There's very few people who I would say, and I think it was Brian Tyler who said this, and I completely agree, is that no matter how much credit John Williams gets, it's almost not enough. You know, it's his career is so fruitful and so inspiring and so important to the history of cinema that I just think that it's you know, it's there's not, I don't think there's any really words to describe it completely, but I just cannot wait to see what John Williams does next, and I'm sort of forever grateful for his contributions to this industry.
Absolutely. I mean, he showed the world of cinema. I mean, he is one of the guys that showed the world of cinema how important music is and how it should be treated. And I hope he continues to do so. But of course, John Williams being 87, we need to cherish every new score that he writes, and we cannot thank him enough for his major contributions to the world of cinema.
And my hope is that as the years and the decades continue, is that we continue to sort of study, continue to respect, appreciate, continue to cherish his legacy, and continue to carry on some of the things that he's really helped to bring to life in his career. The detail in the writing, the specific styles. I just hope that we continue to carry that on into future generations.
Absolutely. I mean, he's so brilliant not only at writing a whole score, but also he's a very theme-oriented composer, and he's written so many great themes that many people know. I mean, Jaws, for instance, you can play the main title, and probably most people would know, or Star Wars, of course, or Superman. We actually forgot to talk about Superman, which is one of his best main titles and best themes.
Yeah, another one that we forgot. But yeah, I mean, again, there's no way at all to cover his career in 1 hour. There's no, in terms of everything that he has done. Again, we could spend 3 episodes just on E.T. So
yes.
So but anyways, it was wonderful talking to you, Michael, about John Williams, and thank you everyone so much for listening to this episode. There's going to be a lot more, so we look forward to doing more of these.
Absolutely. It was a pleasure talking to you again and discussing the magic of film music, and I can't wait to share this episode with our audience and also do many more in the future. And thank you, Ashton, and thank you everybody out there for listening.
Absolutely.
Goodbye.
Thank you so much, guys. See ya.